Cherry Poppin' Daddy Song, Cherry Poppin' Daddy Song. It's time to talk about the Zoot Suit Riots. That's my best interpretation of how the beat of that song goes.
Oh, okay, yeah. I don't remember at all, and I'm glad I don't.
You don't remember your favorite song from the 90s?
Yeah, I do remember Walking on Sunshine.
My favorite swing revival song.
Yeah.
I'm walking on Zoot Suits. Well, that's what these people were doing. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Now we're going to study everyone's favorite part of an explosion, the fuse. It was a fashionable fuse. What a fashionable fuse. I'm going to reiterate a little bit what it looked like and what it meant. I have a little bit more to say about what it meant.
Okay.
Zoot Suit, a.k.a. drape shapes, or the drape, people would call it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess you're saying it came from drape suits, the Zoot Suits, but it came from Harlem.
Yeah.
Harlem in the 30s.
I like how aggressively you said that. It came from Harlem.
Okay, that's my new science fiction novel. It was the style of choice amongst young black men going through the next phase of Harlem after the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah.
So this was the new thing. It was worn by... We're here to interview you. You're not getting the job. Someone just walked in and I riffed.
That was a good riff, too. He was long gone by the time you said any of that.
Yeah, well, he felt it. So it was worn by the people going to the new music clubs, and soon the musicians themselves were wearing these Zoot Suits. Most notably Cab Calloway, who called them the only totally and truly American civilian suit. He screamed it.
Hello, God, it's me, Cab Calloway,
and I'm wearing a Zoot Suit. I was crazy about Cab Calloway for like a year.
Yeah, I remember that.
Now, what did they look like? Big white hat, long coat that went to the fingertips with overly broad shoulders, high-waisted pants that ballooned out and then tightened up the ankles, complete with a long chain hanging down to the knees. Some people wore pants called ankle chokers because they were so tight at the ankles that they would need lubricant to get them on over their feet. The suits were colorful and they were usually worn with pointy shoes or boot shiny, pompadour haircut on top, ducktail on the back.
It's a great look.
The original mullet. So it started out as a black male fashion statement, but there were other minorities who were going to these clubs where the people were wearing them. They were getting inspired to dress the same as them. So it was not only now young black men, but young Jewish men, young Italian men, those people in the mafia, young Filipino men, most notably young Latino men dressing in Zoot Suits now.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just one group. It's easy to focus on those were Mexican people. No, it was a lot of different oppressed people that were wearing it. It was already a sort of uniform of young men who weren't accepted in mainstream society at the time, and that was something that played perfectly into a feeling that second generation Mexican kids in Los Angeles were dealing with at the time, like you were saying. But I'm going to say it again. They didn't quite identify or want to be part of their Mexican culture, and at the same time, they didn't quite identify or want to be part of or were allowed to be part of American culture. Yeah. So they decided to make a third culture for themselves, and these young men called themselves Pachucos, and the Zoot Suit was their uniform for a lot of people. They didn't want to be confined to the parts of town that were relegated to Latinos, but they were also being abused and humiliated by the white parts of town whenever they went there. So this new identity was a way to reclaim their dignity and create their own acceptance.
We will not be partying in Brentwood this evening.
No,
Thank
not
you.
today.
Not today. El Monte sounds just fine with me.
I'm surprised that some of the areas that we're going to be talking about, like you came all the way from Boyle Heights for this?
I remember hearing Jaime Hernandez talk about, because he grew up in Oxnard and he come all the way to Hollywood. I'm like, that's far.
Yeah.
You came all the way over here to party? That's far.
I came all the way here to party. So they even made up their own slang, the Pachucos. It was called Calo. All this was done, they were wearing Zoot suits. Yeah. So a kid at the time said that the suit made him feel empowered, like he was wearing a suit of armor. So it made you feel good to dress like this. Its flamboyantness was also an affront to the conventional image of masculinity at the time, and it wasn't just a look for men either. There were Pachucos who wore the long coats, but they had sweaters under them and dark lipstick and skirts that stopped above the knees. So that was great. That was the Pachuca look.
That's a great look.
This was their form of resistance for some people. Yeah. Others just liked the way it looked. Yeah. I guarantee it.
I would have been nervous and dressed like that.
Yeah.
Exactly. I would have been confident.
You wanted to fit in because all your friends dressed like that. I like Spitfire.
Yeah, I could kick flip.
It was a ton of different types of Mexican kids dressing like this that didn't necessarily all share the same set of beliefs. They just dressed the same. Yeah. Which made what was about to happen even more horrible and confusing for a lot of people. Racial tension was running high. In Los Angeles during World War II, Executive Order Episode 9066 sent all the Japanese people away. Did you already say that?
I might have.
And the difference between a grand jury and a trial jury.
I'll stop you less than you stopped me.
789. So that was February 1942, but it didn't even take an entire year before people were desperate for a new scapegoat in the city, and they found it in Mexican people. In the 20s, more immigrants were coming into the... have you heard about Bracero? More immigrants were coming into the U.S. from places where people had darker skin. And in 1924, Congress tried to close the borders to everywhere but Northern and Western Europe. Like, nationwide ban.
Yeah.
Not even Canada. But
You're too white.
Pass. So that failed, and after decades of whitewashing and Mexican deportations, in Los Angeles was now becoming noticeably more Mexican again by the 1940s.
Yeah.
Add to that the U.S. made a deal with Mexico during World War II to bring workers from Mexico to California, work agricultural jobs, left empty because Americans got drafted. So this created an even bigger influx of Mexicans into the area that caused a lot of white resentment.
White resentment feels like the only kind of resentment. Go ahead.
Wow, Greg has a lot of white resentment. So it was a lot of white resentment for taking what they saw as their jobs for them, even though they were not in the country.
And now you have a job.
I could do both. I could commute.
I'll work both jobs.
Yeah.
As long as they don't get one job.
Yeah. So now by the early 40s, there were some 250,000 Mexican Americans living in Los Angeles, according to the census, who didn't know how to categorize them other than white. So they were just listed as white.
In quotations.
Yeah.
White.
There's the white
Blanco.
people, and then there's the white people. So a lot of misplaced resentment, a lot of paranoia of the other, and a lot of good old-fashioned white people racism created a perfectly wound racist jack-in-the-box in the city. Wait till you hear what song that was playing. The theme song to The Birth of a Nation. Wait till you hear what it said when it came out. And it didn't help that the newspapers were gladly feeding into people's fears. They started publishing articles saying that any Mexican person in a zoot suit was a gangster. And to be fair, the 38th Street gang was known for wearing zoot suits, but the overwhelming majority of people in zoot suits were just kids trying to fit in. It was your Greg of the 90s.
It was me wearing girl skateboard shirts. Exactly. Girl skateboard shirts. Cargo pants.
Don't get me started on the Adidas riots. Surprisingly, the newspapers at the time run by guys like Harrison Gray Otis didn't see that nuance that not all Mexican people were in gangs. So they kept hammering away the notion that a zoot suit equaled a criminal and created an association in people's minds between Mexican people and crime that is still very much there to a lot of people today. But hey, who actually pays attention to the media? In late 1942...
Fake news, right?
Take news at face value. What's the problem? In late 1942, the thing the local papers focused on in particular was that there was a crime wave being committed by zoot suiters. There were stories of kids in zoot suits beating people up all around town, but there was very little basis in fact for most of these stories. There was crime, like you said, being committed by some kids who happen to wear zoot suits, but not any worse than kids dressed any other way. It was just kids. It was, what's that James Dean movie?
Rebel Without a Cause?
No, another one.
East of Eden, Giant? There's only 3.
No, he did another one recently. I don't remember. Teenage Angst.
It's Rebel Without a Cause. The fact that you said no to that one, weird.
I don't think he was in that one.
It's the
What's
one
with
that
Sal Mineo?
I can't name another Sal Mineo movie.
Well, there weren't many. There was no actual increase in crime during this crime wave. There was no evidence of that. But almost weekly, there was another story in a newspaper about how zoot suiters were going around beating and robbing people. They were being called murderers and rapists for the last time ever in American history. The LA Times called them gamin' dandies and called their suits a badge of delinquency.
Wow. That's just responsible coverage, responsible media coverage.
Headline. In December 1942, there was a big article by the chief of the criminal division of the sheriff's office, Clem Peoples, in a tabloid called Sensation, all about the workings of the Mexican gangs in the city. On December 31st, there was a story about how police claimed a drunken Pachuco shot and killed a cop at a cafe on North Main Street. The Herald Express claimed they got an anonymous tip saying that 500 Pachucos were going to gather one night and kill every cop that they see. We all remember the great Pachuco cop slaughter of 1942.
Exodus,
oh, you don't?
Order 9066?
Yeah. They all opened up their transponders and somehow Yoda had to go first. Very few of these stories had any basis in reality at all. But it played into white people's fears and it sold papers, didn't it? They sold papers, don't they?
Yeah.
It's all just harmless lies to make some money and make people feel safe. Except it wasn't. It made white people hate and fear anyone in a zoot suit and by extension, any Mexican, anyone in a Mexican suit.
Yeah. A what?
People were calling the cops on kids in zoot suits who didn't get off the sidewalk when a white person walked by.
God.
In Los Angeles. This was happening.
Yeah, Los Angeles of the 40s.
Yeah, Los Angeles,
Not really
California.
that long ago.
Earlier in 1942, things had gotten so bad that it was proposed to make a law against wearing zoot suits in Los Angeles, but it was not approved. But towards the end of that year, cops and Latinos were having clashes once a week. By spring 1943, that went up to 2 or 3 clashes every single day. On March 7th, 1943, 2 kids from Southgate named Valentine Valdez Chavez and Adolf Vargas were ordered by the Justice of the Peace to never wear zoot suits again or talk to anyone who does, and have their ducktail haircuts shaved off, and they had to show up to court once a month for a haircut inspection.
Wow. Did the cops have to see their papers? They were fighting the Nazis. I'm confused.
Yeah, it's so weird to have these footage of like, oh, they're cutting these kids' hair in the middle of the street. Oh, what was going on in Germany at the time? Oh, they were cutting Jewish people's hair off in the middle of the street. So this is how crazy a fashion statement was driving people. White people were anxious because of the war, and the best cops in the city were off brutalizing Nazis, so they were looking for any way to feel safe. So they had all these subpar cops. The white people didn't feel safe. So enter the Proud Boys of the U.S. military.
My favorite part of this story is the one that makes me the saddest, but I like trauma.
When the war started, LA was teeming with soldiers stationed nearby, and the majority of them were white from the middle of the country, and it's safe to say that almost all of them had never met a Latino person before. What they saw around LA was a growing population of people who didn't look like them, and in their eyes were un-American because they weren't in the military like they were. They saw these young Mexican men as draft dodgers, but the thing was most of these kids they were seeing were too young to join the military. Over 500,000 Latinos fought in World War II, so right there their hatred was baseless. Just because you wore a zoot suit didn't mean you didn't want to fight for your country. Some didn't, but many did. They were just waiting until they were old enough, and that's why they were in town.
And if you're a draft dodger, it doesn't mean that you're obligated to go. It's like you're waiting for the card to come in the mail.
Yeah, you haven't been drafted
killed in
yet.
Germany. Can't wait to die
Come
in
on
France.
down. Add on top of that, like we talked about, there was the rationing of wool and silk and other clothing materials of zoot suits, of which zoot suits were using more than their fair share of.
That was
these kids
part of the deal.
Yeah, these kids were wearing huge suits made of wool and silk when wool and silk were needed to be turned into bullets. That is so funny. That is.
We should
let me write that down
Let's
again.
make that a thing. Let's make that a thing, huh?
But wait, were the bullets turned into clothes? There was even a Disney short in March 1943 where Donald Duck is tempted to waste resources by an evil Donald Duck wearing a Donald Duck. I know Disney. He was wearing a zoot suit with a swastika bow tie.
Do you know what's bothersome about that?
What
is that? Donald was a sailor.
Wearing a zoot suit. This is Donald Duck ends up savagely beating Zoot Suit Donald Duck. This is not a Disney short that held up very well because this came out before.
Oh, really?
These events happened, yeah.
Oh, so you're saying that Donald Duck inspired mass beatings across the city.
But I've been trying to pin this on Donald Duck for years. I'm just waiting to hire the dream team.
He's our Arthur Lee Allen.
There were underground tailors, bootleg tailors making these suits illegally, so people saw zoot suits as unpatriotic in that sense because it was a waste of resources. And nobody is going to see that as more unpatriotic than some young sailor from Ohio who wanted to go kill Japanese people but was stuck in LA and bored and looking for something to do or looking for trouble to cause. Around May 1943, there were over 18 altercations around LA between soldiers and young men in the city that weren't even always Latino. Like, soldiers were just looking for fights. A lot of the soldiers were just looking for fights. A lot of soldiers were looking for fights. A lot of soldiers were turning to bullets. In one incident, apparently 7 civilians ended up getting killed.
What?
There's not much about that.
Yeah.
It wasn't just LA either. There was also an incident around this same time in Oakland of soldiers attacking Latino and black zoot suiters. On May 10th, a group of Latino kids went to go dancing at the Aragon Ballroom in Venice, or as some local high school white kids put it, a group of Latino kids in zoot suits took over the Aragon Ballroom in Venice.
Like 8 people showed up, like they're taking
They
it
were
over.
salsa dancing. I wanted to do a 2-step. This led to some bored sailors nearby hearing about it and coming over to kick out the zoot suiters, which led to a sailor claiming he got stabbed by one of them, which led to a brawl between 500 sailors and civilians and some kids in zoot suits, which led to the cops arresting all the kids wearing a zoot suit for their own protection. Just 2 days later, a fire broke out in Venice that got blamed on the kids in the zoot suits, even though they were in prison. So this was the climate leading up to May 31st, 1943. A group of sailors was at 699 North Main Street, right near Olvera Street, right near the Italian-American Museum, which loves us. And they started harassing some Latinas, and some zoot suit kids tried to make them stop, and a sailor named Joe Dacey Coleman ended up getting his jaw broken.
Wow.
It doesn't seem like things escalated much after that, but the sailors went back to the Naval Reserve Armory in Chavez Ravine, which is now the Frank Hotchkin Memorial Training Center for the fire department.
They have a piece of the Twin Towers there.
Really? Thieves.
Where'd you get that? Ghouls.
Stories started to circulate in the armory about this incident, and within a couple days, a frenzy was whipped up to how dare an unpatriotic Mexican kid lay a finger on a holy white American soldier. Then comes the night of June 3rd. 50 sailors were so upset about what happened to Coleman that they stormed out of the armory and headed downtown carrying with them clubs and whatever else they had on hand that they could use for a beating.
Yeah.
They went to the 1700 block of North Main Street, kind of near Lincoln Heights, and got into a brawl with, according to the sailors, about 35 Zoot Suiters. Police showed up quickly and promptly arrested the Zoot Suiters and sent the sailors back to the base.
You crazy kids.
You crazy kids. You criminals. Get home, you crazy kids. Get in the car. There were no serious injuries, but this just riled up the sailors at the base even more, and then the story got even more exaggerated. They got beaten unprovoked. They robbed them. How dare they? Then on the night of June 4th, 200 sailors now took to the streets looking for anyone wearing a zoot suit, and the Zoot Suit Riot was on. These white sailors attacked any Latino kid they saw in a zoot suit, beat them up, would rip their clothes, sometimes entirely off, leaving this person naked and beaten in the street. They would pee on the clothes or they would burn them. They went into the California Theater, which is a couple blocks from the Cecil, and made the manager stop the movie, turn on the lights so they could grab anyone wearing a zoot suit, drag them into the street, beat them, rip off their clothes.
Wow.
If you had a ducktail haircut, like we said, they would cut it off after they beat you in the middle of the street. They went on a rampage through downtown. The cops did nothing. The cops followed the sailors around, but were told to let them do whatever they want and let the military...
Who?
By their chief.
Jesus. Who was the chief at the time in the 40s?
I don't know. Hitler?
Was it Jim Davis?
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't. You're right. It doesn't matter.
They were told to let the military police deal with them. They kept saying it's not our job to stop them.
I was just following orders.
Yeah. I was just following orders. Don't quote me in 4 years. They were basically escorts for the sailors, but any Mexican kid in a zoot suit that fought back was immediately arrested and blamed for what was happening.
Yeah.
What a bad day. So you had a bad day. But the sailors must have gotten it out of their system, and they'll leave people alone now, right?
Right.
June 5th. This night, even more sailors came from the armory, and by now the cops actually were doing something. They were joining them. Off-duty cops were now marching side by side with the sailors, beating anyone in a zoot suit. They called themselves the Vengeance Squad.
Vengeance against what?
Against the crime wave. On top of that, since they were cops, they knew where the Pachucos lived, and some of them seemed to have been leading the mobs to the houses of known Pachucos.
Like a private residence.
Yeah. They were stopping the trolley cars in the middle of the street, dragging people in zoot suits off of them, and by this point, it wasn't even just people who were in zoot suits. It was anyone who was Mexican. And it wasn't even just anyone who was Mexican. It was black people. It was Filipino people, whoever happened to be in their way. Even some white kids were getting beaten. They dragged a black man off the trolley who was coming home from his job at a military defense plant. He was a military defense plant worker. In his uniform, they gouged his eye out.
Are you serious?
They dragged him off a trolley and gouged his eye out. The guy making munitions for them. But so much horror and brutality in the streets of LA, certainly the media was outraged. No. Newspapers were praising the sailors as heroes for finally doing something about the Mexican crime wave. The infallible LA Times had a headline that said Zoot Suiters learn lesson and fight with servicemen. One paper ran an article on how to de-zoot a Zoot Suiter properly. Radio stations were broadcasting where they thought the violence was going to take place that night for anyone who might want to join in. And people did. June 6th had an even bigger mob than the night before, and now they were expanding out of downtown. 20 taxi drivers offered free rides to the sailors to take them to Boyle Heights, where they knew Mexican people lived, and the beatings continued there.
It must have been a really great week if you were a Nazi.
I know.
To have free taxi rides.
Yeah, and the underground Nazi movement that was going on at the same time, probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hail Hydra. I learned that in a movie once. But
one of the best movies I've ever seen.
So here, these movies are still coming out. But these sailors weren't alone anymore by this night. Now, in addition to their off-duty cop partners, now they had civilians who wanted in on the violence, some who came all the way from San Diego and Las Vegas just to beat Mexican people. Now they also had Army boys and the Marines coming from Fort MacArthur and El Toro and Orange County joining them.
Shouldn't you be dying in Europe right now?
They were waiting to do that. There was also another group of soldiers roaming the Pike in Long Beach looking for anybody in a zoot suit, and that wasn't even the worst night. Here's June 7th. Some 5,000 white soldiers, cops, civilians were roaming the streets of LA looking for minorities to beat. 5,000 people.
That's a lot of people.
They raided the Orpheum looking for people. By this point, the Mexican community was terrified. There were moms wandering around the streets trying to find their sons. They didn't know where their kids were. They were begging cops not to arrest their sons who were lying beaten on the street street. Please don't arrest my kid. Hundreds of them went to jails hoping that there's someone in there and not dead somewhere. Some of these kids being beaten were 12 years old. And like I said, a lot of them were dressed in zoot suits just because like their brother or their friend dressed like that. They just thought it looked cool. They didn't know the connotations. They didn't know why this was happening to them. It didn't make sense. On top of that, on the night of the 7th, barely half the victims were actually in zoot suits at this point. It's a rampage.
Yeah, it's just minority groups.
Kids were begging cops to arrest them because at least they'd be safe in jail. Yeah. You can't beat me there. Well,
someone else will, but you won't.
Yeah, at least
someone without a club will beat me.
Yeah, it'll be an officially sanctioned beating. The Council for Latin American Youth sent a telegram to President Roosevelt begging him to do something. There was also those who fought back. This is the best part of the story. One group of zoot suiters went to the military bases themselves to try to stop the soldiers before they even left. The best story, here's the whole thing. Our old friend Charlotta Bass.
Oh, okay.
From the California Eagle newspaper
and
the grand jury. Wait, was it the grand jury or the trial jury? The California Eagle newspaper down on Central Avenue, which we've talked about before. From the start of the rioting, she was printing articles decrying the way the other newspapers in town were framing the narrative here and urged the black community to rise up and stand with the Mexican community. She had caught wind that on the night of the 7th, the white mob was planning to start heading down into South Central and Watts and really target the black community. Yeah. She contacted the authorities, urging them, stop the rioters now, because she knew that if a bunch of white people come down into Watts, someone's going to die and it's not going to be a black person. You have to put a stop to this. Nobody did anything. Nobody ever stops anything, because bad people rule the world. So instead, the Mexican and black community united and met at the intersection of 12th and Central, hid most of their group in alleys and out of sight, and left 20 black men in the middle of the street, and they waited. Right on cue, a mob of white people started marching down the street towards that intersection. Yeah. When they got there, 500 black and Mexican men, women, boys, girls, rival gang members, they all came out of the shadows and surrounded the white mob, who of course freaked out and tried to run. That's when the cops showed up and arrested as many people of color as they could. Some people look back on this as the Battle of 12th Street, which is great. Wow. This didn't end the violence. The mob just went to other parts of the town and did the stuff I was describing to you. But because of this, the next day, June 8th, the Navy and Army ordered the city of LA off limits to all unauthorized military personnel. They even had military police patrolling the streets to arrest any soldiers that they found ignoring the ban. It took the community standing up for the military. But again, the military...
Standing up against the military.
Yes, to fight the military. This wasn't an admission of guilt by the military. They defended the actions of the soldiers, but they claimed they were afraid of the soldiers becoming so rowdy they'd mutiny or something like that. I don't know what their reasoning was, but they weren't allowed in LA anymore. The city of LA wanted to end too, but not because they didn't like what was happening. They just realized the Latino community was the workforce they were depending on during the war, and they didn't want them damaged.
Don't damage my cogs. Jesus.
Even so, that same day, the LA City Council banned zoot suits in Los Angeles. What? They said the zoot suit has become a badge of hoodlumism.
As a bunch of people in Navy outfits stand behind them.
Nice uniform.
Yeah, boys, you look great.
Looking good, boys. We prohibit nudism by an ordinance, and if we can arrest people for being underdressed, we can do so for being overdressed. If you were caught wearing a zoot suit in LA, you had to go to jail for 50 days. Yeah. On June 9th, there were still a few stray confrontations, but nothing nearly as bad as what had happened a couple days before. And on June 10th, it was pretty much over. In the end, luckily, there were no deaths, but the number of victims seriously injured, it ranges from around 90 to 150 amongst the Latino and minority, as opposed to the 18 soldiers that got hurt. The numbers for arrests range too, but it's estimated that as many as 600 Latinos were taken in during the riots, while a whopping 9 soldiers were arrested. The rioting was over in LA, but over the next few weeks, similar incidents broke out in other parts of California, also Texas, Arizona, Chicago, Detroit, New York City. 2 guys in Gene Krupa's band were beaten for wearing zoot suits on stage in Philadelphia.
Wow, Philly.
Always on brand, Philadelphia. The general consensus from the rest of the country looking from the outside at what had happened in LA was that people felt the soldiers had acted racistly, and this was a bad thing. Yeah. Eleanor Roosevelt condemned the actions of the soldiers. That's not how the establishment in LA saw it. The LA Times responded to Eleanor Roosevelt's feeling by calling her a communist and saying we like the Mexicans and think they like us. And thus La Opinion was born. Mayor Fletcher Bowron blamed the riots not on racism but on juvenile delinquents.
Bowron, you're letting me down.
I know. Finally, Governor Earl Warren, later of the Warren Report, formed a committee to investigate why all this happened, and they concluded that it was in fact racism.
Turns out racism.
Racism. It was racism with the help of its old allies, the LAPD, doing nothing to stop anything, and local media coverage fanning the flames. In response, the LA County Board of Supervisors started new human relations committees and made the LAPD start giving training to its officers in a revolutionary new idea to start treating all people as equals.
I'm glad that worked out from the 40s on.
No,
I'm glad.
Problem solved. It was all worth it. There was a lot of fear and confusion that week left in the city. Some suspected the LAPD orchestrated the whole thing to distract people from a cop that was on trial at the time.
Wow.
But what was confusing still is that this is still referred to as a riot.
It's not.
There were some people taking advantage of the chaos and looting and mugging and stuff like that, but not many. A riot is an oppressed community venting their rage and frustration at how they're being treated. This wasn't that. This was the majority ganging up and attacking the minority. This wasn't a riot. It was crystal knocked on the streets of Los Angeles, which I've explained to you many times. You keep saying that sounds delicious, and I keep having to explain to you what it is. All it did was scare an entire generation of the local Latino community. These families saw what their white neighbors really felt about them and what they were capable of, and all they learned was that they were behaving like animals, and the authorities gave them permission to do whatever they wanted. They were being attacked for the way they dressed, exactly how you see people ripping hijabs off Muslim women today. Like, it's the same thing. This scared a lot of families into assimilating as quick as they could, and they would abandon their culture. No more speaking Spanish. We're American now. It was a sad thing, but guess what? That abandoning of the culture led to the rise of the Chicano movement a couple decades later and made the community stronger than ever. Very important people learned lessons from the Zoot Suit Riots, because as it turns out, even though they weren't in LA at the time, Cesar Chavez and Malcolm X were Zoot Suit kids. Dolores Huerta was a Pachuca, and these riots showed them the country's true colors. And once they got a little older, they had formed some very strong opinions about that. Now, excuse me, because I've been sitting on my giant oversized chain for the last 20 minutes, and I can't feel my legs through my helium-filled balloon pants.
I've been sitting on my hair for like an hour now.
This ducktail's itching me. So those are the Zoot Suit Riots. Another horrible chapter of Los Angeles history.